couple more minutes as people are beginning to, there we go, people are beginning to join. Okay. There we go. We are so used to just being able to click on something that when we're asked to enter numbers into a website, it's far too complicated and confusing for us. I'll start again. So thank you for being with us this evening, especially for just giving us your time instead of sitting in the sun outside. I'm especially excited by this evening's lecture with Professor Shani Orgad. As always, what we're going to do is have a shortish lecture, and then if you have questions, we will have the opportunity for some questions at the end. If we stay a relatively kind of discrete small number, then we will be able to ask questions yourselves. If not, if we start to grow, then please do send your emails to me, to josh@alyth.org.uk, and I will ask Shani your questions as well as my questions. Without any further ado, I think we all know how this works. I'm going to hand over to Shani. Thank you for being with us this evening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me. And thank you all for coming, as Rabbi Josh said, on such a very hot day. So what I'd like to speak about today is to kind of tell you a little bit about my recent book, which was based on a study I did here in the UK. I'm based at the LSE, at the London School of Economics. I'm a sociologist by training. And I'll start sharing my screen with you because I'll use some slides. I hope everyone can see them. Yeah, great. So let me put it on screen mode. Okay. The book is called Heading Home: Motherhood, Work, and the Failed Promise of Equality. And it looks at the relationship between these issues, but it particularly is based on a study I've done based on interviews with women who are professional women in various occupations, and I'll talk about it in a minute, and who left paid employment in the context of having children and starting a family. Before I start, however, I want to tell you, I'll give you kind of not a summary of the book, but some highlights or key themes. Before I start, I think I like to kind of situate myself in my work. I think oftentimes we social scientists generally tend to kind of present everything as if we were completely detached from it. So that's not the nature of my work, at least. And my own relationship to work and family has been profoundly shaped by this woman. So on the left-hand side, it's the woman who, at the top of the hay. On the right-hand side picture, it's the woman on the far right. And this is my grandmother. Her name is Batya Goldberg, and she emigrated to Israel in 1934 from Silupe in Latvia as a kibbutz pioneer, as you can see in these wonderful pictures. And all her life, she worked alongside male and female peers, earlier on road construction, agriculture, milking cows. In fact, as she was milking cows, she was milking cows when she was heavily pregnant with my dad. Literally, as she was milking the cows, started having her first contractions and was rushed to the hospital in Tiberias, near the kibbutz where she was, which is Kibbutz Kinneret, near the Sea of Galilee. And my grandmother continued to work for many years, in fact, until the age of 79, very close to her death, in various jobs, whatever was available and needed in the kibbutz, in the communal kitchen, in the kibbutz's clothes storage, as a packer in the kibbutz's dates factory. And she also was a mother for 4 sons whom she loved dearly. She took a great pleasure in motherhood and in being a grandmother later. And I think one of the fundamental memories from her, for me, was that she never complained. She did some very demanding, physically demanding jobs. She would rise in the morning at 5:30 a.m. every morning, working long hours, often in much scorching heat, much worse heat than here. And so this is, you know, I'm giving it, we might come back to it when we have some, hopefully, time for questions. But this is for me a really important context, personal context, in terms of my entry into this project about the relationship between women, work, and motherhood. And obviously, both my grandmother and myself, we've taken very different paths from the women that I interviewed. But what to me is important is actually not so much to stress the differences between me and the women I interviewed, but in fact the similarities. And the book, that's the book cover, derived partly also from my personal experience. We live in Muswell Hill, and I would often, when I'd take my two sons, who are now older and in secondary school, but when they were in primary school, I'd often drop them off in the morning. And I would see a lot of these mothers who I knew had some previous careers, some of them in very successful careers, but they stopped and they quit their jobs and they became stay-at-home mothers. And I was curious, but I never kind of probed or never wanted to ask. Until one day, oftentimes I would come in the morning, drop off the kids, would rush. My lectures would normally start at 10 in Holborn in central London, so I would be in quite a hurry. And lots of these mothers would gather together and go to have a coffee morning or something of this kind. And one day, one of them approached me and she says, "Are you coming for coffee morning?" And I said, "No, I'm really sorry, I can't." And she said, Why can't you join us?" And I said, "I'm dashing off to work." And that was after a few years we've known each other, so they knew I was in full-time work. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, you poor thing." And she looked at me like she gave me this really pitying look, and I was genuinely puzzled by this comment and wondered why she felt sorry for me. And I knew that she specifically, and many of these other women I've seen around, were in paid work, had professional careers, and I'd often wondered what explains their exit from the workplace, especially since they were in successful careers. And I became increasingly curious about this group of women. And consequently started the project. First, I looked at the statistics, and with the help of one of the leading economists of UK labour here in the UK, her name is Dr. Gillian Paul, we conducted a large-scale analysis of UK's labour force survey. And what you can see here, that although the group of women that I'm talking about is a clear minority, the consistent fact we see in the UK, we see it in the US and other places, that mothers are twice as likely than women without children to leave the workforce. And that might come as no surprise, but I would say, or I would suggest, that it should surprise us in 2020 that this is still the case. And if we look further, what we found is that 20% of mothers with partners in the top quartile of earnings stay at home, and 17% of stay-at-home mothers are professional. To me, this was puzzling. So again, we're talking about relatively a minority group, of course, but it's still quite an astonishing figure. And you can see that the figures from the US are mirroring similar patterns. In the US, in fact, even more, 25% of all stay-at-home mothers have college degrees. But as we know, statistical analysis can offer us very good entry point, but it can't tell us or can answer the question that at least really interested me, which is why? Why women who would give up years of education, of training, of successful careers, seemingly to embrace full-time motherhood, why do educated mothers who can, and that's an important fact because most of these women were generally, I'd say, middle class, if not upper middle class. So these are women who could and can afford the help of childcare. Why would they make a choice where the question is not that they can't pay, that doesn't, you know, the conventional wisdom that it doesn't make sense for me to go out to work because all the money I will earn will pay for childcare. And what I found particularly perplexing about this group of women, and the kind of ages ranged between the 30s and the late 50s, and between women who are 3 years out of work up to 17 years out of work, in a range of professions, from engineers to lawyers, accountants, teachers, social workers. I interviewed even a train driver, a variety of these occupations. The majority of the women I've interviewed grew up in or came of age and were part of a generation that in many ways reaped the fruits of the long struggle of the feminist movement, and particularly of the second wave feminist movements in the 70s. The struggle to create precisely those conditions that will enable women to pursue the choices across all areas of life. So just to give you a sense, these are kind of some of the kind of references, cultural points of references that were mentioned during the interviews by many of the women I interviewed. These are the kind of cultural and social points of references that these women came of age and grew up with. Many of them were actually working class, were daughters, working class parents who wanted them to do better. And they came of age amidst these discourses of girl power. You can see, some of you may remember the kind of movie Working Girl with Sigourney Weaver and her name is, and Melanie Griffith, Baby Boom with Diane Keaton. Also, some of them were daughters or were very close to the Greenham Common peace camp. Dolly Parton in 9 to 5, the miners' wife during the miners' strike, and particularly here Gail Downs, and the kind of power of sisterhood and that message. So these are the messages that surrounded the time when they came of age and entered the workforce. And indeed, most of them had high aspirations in terms of pursuing successful careers. And as I said, a lot of them were daughters of working parents, so they were pushed to do what their parents couldn't do, and to go to university and to pursue higher education and so on. And around the time, and as they kind of embarked on their career and later on, and also around the time I then started my research later on, these messages from the 80s were moving quite a fast forward, if you wish, to new messages or newish messages of these kinds that really replete today in our cultural landscape. Messages from Sheryl Sandberg, famous lean-in, movies like The Good Wife or Borgen, for those of you who saw it, all these kind of type of advice books and memoirs and so on, fundamentally really about women's successful ability to combine careers with motherhood, really, and this holy grail, if you wish, of work-life balance. And so in a cultural landscape like this one, it really further puzzled me, or the puzzle that animated my research was why these educated women who grew up in this cultural climate and in the context of policymakers and politicians championing women in the workforce, not outside the workforce, why did they make this choice? And this is why the whole book is really juxtaposed against these messages, against these cultural narratives, and women's often quite painful accounts of their choices, and I'd put choice in quotation marks because they refer to themselves to the choice as a forced choice, as one of my interviewees told me. So I want to very briefly just take you through some of the key themes of the book. I want again to emphasize that this is a minority, it represents a minority group, but at the same time, the issues that they talked about, the themes that the book highlights on the basis of the interviews I did with women, are very much, in many ways, distill, I think, the pivotal facets of the broader crisis around gender, family, and work under or in contemporary capitalism. So one of the key themes that emerged from women's interviews was what I call toxic work cultures. They were deeply disillusioned and disempowered by their attempts to combine motherhood and a high-powered career in what I call toxic overwork culture, to describe cultures where working is continuously in a crisis mode. And the ideal worker in these work cultures is the always-on worker, yeah? So women described how they were always on. And I want to emphasize that while previously, or perhaps during the 80s, even the 90s, this toxicity was characteristic only or predominantly of what was called the greedy professions, the sectors of finance, law, consulting. There's more and more evidence, and that came across very clearly from the interviews with the women I spoke, that this always-on culture is now becoming more entrenched and applies to all sectors. Women who were teachers, women who were social workers, women who were artists describe this toxic work culture that is partly exacerbated by the availability of technology, mobile phones, and so on. And there's a lot of evidence, lots of research that shows that women, that the stress affects men and women, but that women report higher levels of stress, in fact, of men. That might be surprising. And I want to also crucially emphasize that this toxicity of the workplace doesn't characterize only women's work cultures. It, of course, applies to men. And that was a very important aspect in these women's accounts. I should say that I've only interviewed women who were heterosexual. Most of them were married, some were divorced. And a key factor that has pushed them out of the workforce wasn't necessarily always just their work cultures, but the work cultures of their husbands or their male partners. And so the paradox is that men today also are kind of encouraged to lean in, as it were, to become more involved fathers, to become egalitarian partners. But there's something quite rigid and a lot of research highlights the rigidity of work cultures that don't enable men and women to participate in meaningful ways in family life. It just as an anecdote, but it's really, I think, illustrates, it wasn't uncommon for the husbands of the women I interviewed to not see their children during the week because they would leave home early and returned after the children were in bed or even and often were on a lot of business travel. So this is something I think, we might take it for granted, but it is some food for thought and should be, in my view, quite shocking in 2020 that this is a reality, that fathers do not see their children during the week because of these toxic work cultures. And what was very striking in my interviews with women is that on the one hand, these are highly educated women. They were able to give me a very clear account of the systemic work cultures issues. So they talk about pay inequalities. They talked about how presence was kind of foregrounded and counted more than quality. They talked about how they were excluded from major projects as soon as they announced their pregnancy or as soon as they returned from maternity leave. They talked about lots of systemic structural discrimination. But while they acknowledged all this and really clearly gave me a very clear analysis of this confluence of structural factors, a lot to do with the work cultures, either of their own workplaces or their husbands, nevertheless, they repeatedly consigned their resignation from their jobs to a personal failure, even to a pathology, I'd say. And this is something that was very much kind of vivid in the way that after women would give me, say, an hour interview explaining me the fundamental issues in their workplace, they would say things like, I couldn't get the balance right. I was just stepping over the threshold of perfectionism. I'm not a natural. The reason I left work, one said, is the problem was my lack of confidence. I was not cut out for this type of demanding job. And this is sometimes after years that I've done this job and done it successfully and performed extremely well. I didn't have the ambition it takes. There's something wrong with my personality. So they recast these structural barriers as a personal failure, as a personal problem. And one kind of quick illustration of this, I think, was quite poignant to me, was a woman called Susan who she'd studied and practiced medicine and was about to become a clinical geneticist before she first became a GP. So she deferred her desire and her plan to become a clinical geneticist and became a GP and then quit altogether. And she told me about the many years she studied and the ambition and how she was ambitious to do it. And at the same time, she says, I think partly because, I think if I'd been really ambitious, I wouldn't have given it up. And I asked her, how come you're saying that you're not very ambitious after studying for so many years, after practicing medicine, planning to be a clinical geneticist? And she admits in the end, and she looks at me and she said, but yes, I suppose it's a bit contradictory, but, and she pauses. Yeah, it is a bit contradictory as well. And then she starts laughing quite hysterically. And then silence falls. And then she says, yes, I think, and she pauses again. And it's a painful pause. I think if I'd been really ambitious, I would have just said I wasn't going to go and take care of the family, and I would have carried on, you know. So it's this kind of contradiction that came out as one of the fundamental tensions throughout the interviews in the book. And the way I'm thinking of it is that the women I interviewed, or many of them, internalized what me and my colleague Rosalind Gill, what we call the confidence culture. There's now kind of a plethora of self-help advice books, programs, training programs, blogs, hashtags. On the left-hand side, that's social psychologist Amy Cuddy, who has one of the most successful, most watched and popular TED Talks, where she talks about women needing to fake it till you make it, adopt some what she calls power poses, and just become confident. And the premise in many of the messages today, and these messages that the women I interviewed were very much subjected to, is that there's some kind of a crisis, inherent and particular to women. And this is about us women lacking confidence somehow. And that the key to overcoming the barriers in the workplace is to become confident, to adopt what the journalist Kathy Kate and Claire Shipman called the confidence code. And so the problem with these messages is that they completely or almost completely individualize and psychologize the problem. It's all about you. If you only work on yourself, if you only download this app, and there's even the French government has made this app available to all women, where for boosting your confidence and with simulation about how to negotiate raise of your salary. Now, I'm not suggesting that these might not be helpful, but the difficulty is that they're so dominant in directing the focus of both the problem and the solution onto the individual, and they obscure, therefore, the structural issues. And so my interviewees indeed repeatedly personalized and individualized both the factors that led them to quit and their failure to mitigate these factors. And so while Sheryl Sandberg, for those of you who may have read or heard about Lean In, she calls on women to internalize the revolution. The women I interviewed instead internalized the blame. A second and related theme that have come out really powerfully is what I call the myth of work-life balance. And it's a myth because, again, many of the women referred to this idea of work-life balance, but also this kind of almost ideal feminine figure of the balanced woman. The woman who manages to juggle it all. This is just, I did a cursory search on Google Images. I typed women work-life balance. That's the kind of images that come out. And so, if we look back to the 80s when these women came of age, this is a kind of, if you wish, a more sober, I would say, version of the superwoman of the 80s, because there is some recognition of the struggles that women are having to deal with today, the need to balance it all. You can see it in some of these images. But ultimately, I don't know about you, to me, all these women seem quite happy, quite neat, quite confident overall. They even managed to meditate here on the left-hand side at the bottom of the slide. And it's important because these are the images and these are the kind of narratives and powerful kind of ideas that resonated in a lot of the interviews with the women I spoke to, and that not just resonated, but haunted them. So on the one hand, most of the women I talked to really rejected this, and they would say, oh, work-life balance, it's a joke. No woman can achieve it. Nobody can achieve it. It's all a construction. But on the other hand, again, they kept kind of desiring this possibility. So it's this image that that is impossible to achieve, and yet you continuously work to try and achieve it. And here I want to give you again a very short extract from my interview with a woman who's called Louise, and these are, of course, all pseudonyms. She was a former marketing director who worked in a highly demanding job, and her job was fundamentally, profoundly incompatible with family life. And a year after her first child was born, she decided to quit. She took her workplace to court and won in court on legal discrimination, on sexual discrimination. I won't bore you with the details. So I think I'm mentioning it because this is a woman who really understood that there's something structurally, profoundly problematic, and she took action. At the same time, in the same interview where she told me about the profoundly structural issues in her workplace which discriminated her, she also says, I felt guilty, you know, some people are probably very good at just doing it. I mean, without making a big deal of it. Some women hold down extremely high-powered jobs. Their kids are fine, they're fine. And I know that people can do it and they can do it well, but for me, I just needed to stop working. And then she repeats, I do have to find a job, I have to find a job. And so this other woman, and this is something that's repeated in a lot of the interviews, and what was very striking is that when I asked women, who are these other women? Who is this kind of balanced women? Can you give me an example? And they would often just fall silent or start laughing, and they would say, they would stumble. So this other woman operates, if you wish, as a powerful disciplinary figure over Louise's thinking and over the feelings of many of the women I've interviewed. And she performs this kind of psychological obligation to be balanced and, crucially, as Louise says here, without making a big deal of it, without complaining, you know, suck it up, as it were. This is, again, a very important tension between these messages that surround these women and the narratives, and they hear it from their workplaces, from the media, from the government, but also from their mother-in-laws, from their mothers-in-law, from their own mothers, from their husbands often. And finally, I want to end with the third theme, which is inequality at home, because I think oftentimes the discussion really focuses on how women's equality at work can be improved and strengthened, which is fundamental, but without noting and remembering that we cannot carry on talking about women's equality in the workplace and about gender pay gap if it's disconnected from what's happening at home. And that's something that came out so clearly in all of the interviews, where the women were what's called the foundation parents. So even in situations where the woman earned more than her husband, and that I've had quite a few women I've interviewed where that was the situation, she nevertheless did the bulk of the work. She nevertheless did the bulk of the childcare. And so it was a combination of having to do the lion's share of the chores, the parentings in the home, and working in workplaces that are deeply incompatible with family life that's propelled these women to leave work. And I will end on just saying that what struck me is that despite these enormously painful, but also very sharp and clear accounts of structural barriers and of really a process by which women really had to suppress, if not completely withdraw, their desires and their dreams. Nevertheless, one thing that was common to all the women I interviewed was that they continuously, what I call, muted their disappointment, their disavowed anger. They hushed their disappointment. They said, I don't want to have this conversation, not with my husband, not with the workplace. And so there were pent-up feelings of frustration, of disappointment, of an anger. And one final illustration was of a woman who was a very highly successful high-flyer news producer, who left actually, and when her husband was far more junior, he was a lawyer. And she tells me how even while she was working and now, she says, I'm thinking when I'm putting out food on the table every dinner, I put the boys down first, then my husband, then me. And I'm thinking, it's wrong, isn't it? So I'd evidently think of myself as being the person, I'm not terribly upset about that. Don't get me wrong, but it's just something I have noticed, you know. Maybe I should be more upset about it. I don't know. Do you have to listen back to this? And she laughs. There's quite a lot in there, isn't there? And that was a very, a very painful moment. of recognizing that perhaps she should have been more upset about it, but that she has suppressed, indeed muted her disappointment and succumbed in many ways, not just to the role of the selfless mother that our culture still valorizes, but also to the role of selfless wife. Note that she serves everybody food before herself. She knows she should be more upset about it, and yet she suppresses it. And that was for me the final kind of surprise in my project, because I think I couldn't quite make sense of why women have suppressed this very deep frustration, anger often that they really had for years and accumulated, particularly in a culture and in a moment of Me Too, where we see, if you wish, an explosion of female anger today and female rage. Women are now said to called on and urged to express their anger, to embrace anger and so on. But at the same time, I think it's true, and we see a lot of this. I think at the same time, there's also consistent, and that's something that has come up a lot. They said to me in subtle and more explicit ways how they have been encouraged to keep calm and carry on. Not surprising that that's a popular mask now in the pandemic context. There's a constant message and a parallel message, and paradoxically contradictory message to the lean in and be angry and don't and demand what you deserve and so on. There's a parallel message of be patient, be calm, carry on, or as Louise said, don't make a fuss, just get on with it. That's a very strong message that these women received from their workplace as well as from their own family members. And I think it's something that we see even in well-intended messages like reports, like the WEF's annual report about the global pay gap. And we hear year in, year out that the global pay gap will take 202 years or 170 years to close, as if it was this natural process, organic process that we are all observing, and that it advances at this glacial pace, and it will naturally reach its desired goal in whatever 2002 years and close. And perhaps more provocatively, some of you may remember the prestigious Lord Jonathan Sumption, who a few years ago, when he talked about the stark lack of judicial diversity in the UK Supreme Court, he said, we're simply deluding ourselves if we try to pretend that selection from that pool on merit alone will produce a fully diverse or even a reasonably diverse judiciary quickly. In this area, he says, as in life generally, we just cannot have everything we want. We have to make choices and to accept impure compromises. We may even have to learn patience. And it seems to me, based on this most recent photo of the Supreme Court judges, that indeed patience it is. We see here only 3 women in this photo, as you can see, not to mention the fact that they're all white. And also the women I interviewed seem to have largely followed the advice of Lord Sumption, and they learned patience, they learned self-restraint, they hushed their disappointment, they hushed their anger at these patriarchal structures that were obstacles and that have pushed them out of the workforce and inhibited their ambitions and their desire. But they abandoned complaints, they abandoned critiques, they don't complain. This is why I ended my book. The conclusion is called Impatience, and I offer some ways of thinking forward. I'll just go through them very quickly because I want to leave time for conversation. I think there's an urgent task of uncovering and critiquing and challenging at the macro level, but also the micro level, this idea that somehow economic production is more important than social reproduction, that the work that the unpaid, fundamentally unpaid work of care that is taking place at home. And this pandemic, I think, has really thrown this into sharp light. We need to challenge the glorification of this always-on productivity culture, this idea that there's something desired or ideal or cool about being always on, and that productivity is all about kind of being all the time in this crisis mode. And this would go with debunking these cultural fantasies that I described of the balanced woman that actually does not exist probably, but still haunts so many women and makes them internalize the blame. I spoke about this kind of idea of really unveiling what's the social reproduction that facilitates this kind of myth of work-life balance. There's a whole, army of people, including cleaners and nannies, again, highly feminized jobs that are often called or framed as low skills, that facilitates this work-life balance. It's never not only about individual confidence, ambition, and so on. Detoxifying work structures and cultures, that's a huge project, but it's something that is urgent. And creating workplaces that allow not just women, both women and men, to participate in family life, and I would say life, in a more meaningful way. And finally, unmute and, if you wish, deprivatize disappointment. And although I did this project before the pandemic, I want to end with the pandemic because so many of these issues, in fact, all of these issues seem to me to be pressing now when we have growing evidence about the ways in which women in the UK and the US and also elsewhere are significantly more likely to have lost their jobs already or suffered a fall in earnings since the start of the pandemic. And this is even after accounting for differences in type of occupation, because what seems to kind of bias the statistics is that lots of women are in sectors like hospitality or leisure that have been hit very strongly. But even if you account for these differences, women are still much more significantly to have lost their jobs. And if we look at mothers, UK mothers are almost half more likely, twice more likely, to have lost their job or quit. And crucially, of course, the proportion of UK mothers who report now being responsible for 90 to 100% of childcare has risen. It was 27% in the beginning of lockdown. It's now 45% during lockdown. 7 in 10 mothers say they're completely or mostly responsible for homeschooling. So all this recent evidence, I think, is closely connected to the issues I talked about, work cultures that continue to be toxic online and on Zoom, despite the fact that they might not be in the office, profound inequalities at home, and finally, all this kind of still lots of, as I said, fantasies and cultural myths about who is the ideal worker, what and how she should perform. So I want to end on this. It's on a bleak note, perhaps, but it's also with the message of being impatient and taking actions and not accepting this. Thank you.
Shani, thank you. We are going to have some time for questions. So I'm going to start and then we'll open it up more broadly. So if you want to unmute your video, if you want to make yourself visible and wave, then to ask questions, then please do so. Just let me know that you have a question. I mean, it sounds like there's a kind of semi-manifesto to go with this around impatience. In practical terms, what does that mean? Because isn't there a risk that just as there's been a kind of individualization of responsibility and blame, there's also an individualization of responsibility for change as well. That is, lots of individual women are asked to affect change in their workplaces, but thereby to make themselves incredibly vulnerable in exactly the culture that you've spoken about. So what's the kind of the global response as opposed to the individualized response?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. First of all, I'd say that my manifesto is one that emerges from, it's not a manifesto that I am a feminist researcher, but this was really a bottom-up research, and these are things that were very much informed by the accounts of these women. I think you're absolutely right, and I'm addressing here not just women, but equally men. So I think the fight should be collective and joint. But also at the global level, I think in terms of there's a lot to be done with legislation and with policy changes. Jacinda Ardern is now talking about moving to a 4-day working week, for instance. Yeah. Here in the UK, I don't know if you remember when in the run-up to the election, in the Prime Minister question, when Corbyn, and I'm not kind of suggesting that I was a supporter or am a supporter of Corbyn, but he did raise the possibility of 4-day working week, and there was a huge laughter in the studio. So the idea, the notion that somehow we can be as productive or have lives that are more truly balanced and that allow both work and life to be combined and compatible is still laughable. And I think that can't happen just by women or men fighting in the workplace. I think there's some lessons we can certainly learn from the Nordic countries, for instance, about paternity leave. In the UK, paternity leave is an opt-in, and the take-up since it was introduced a few years ago is, should I say, pathetic. The figures show it's somewhere, they're not very reliable, the figures, but it's between 4% and 1% take-up of paternity leave by men, whereas it's an opt-out scheme in many of the Nordic countries, and it's a take it or lose it. And both the couple gets together time, and if the man or the woman, for that matter, don't take it, they lose it. There's lots of structural changes that I think needs to be done urgently. I do think we individuals have responsibility to fight for them, but the key thing is it's not about changing ourselves or just fixing ourselves. It's not just about how can I be more confident. It's about how I can demand and contribute to a workplace that would enable me being confident. So at a global level, I think if anything that this pandemic has thrown into sharp relief just how crucial the work that is done at home is, and the ways in which it should be valued and respected, which is not the stories I've heard from the women I've interviewed. And again, that cuts across from women who worked in the city, but also women who worked at schools as teachers or as deputy head teachers, which describe these kind of always on crisis mode, very greedy workplaces. Again, we can develop this, but I think there's work to be done at the legal level, at the policy level, and the structure level of workplace cultures. You know, they don't change within a day or within overnight, but we have to start somewhere. And there are examples of, obviously there are positive examples. I'm not suggesting that there aren't, but I think overall the picture is, there's much to be done yet. I'll leave it at that, if that's okay.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open it up to people, and then I've got lots more. But so the toxic, always-on culture and the work-life balance myth are things that affect men as well. And you've just told us that the take-up of paternity leave is pathetic in this country, which we know is true. So why is it that men are not rebelling? What does the structure, what does the system do for men? Or is it about expectations around, is it lack of role models? Is it expectations about male roles? Or is it fundamentally that there's kind of male investment in a structure which fundamentally excludes women to male benefit?
Well, I think it's all of the above. I want to say very clearly that, a very early draft that I wrote, a male colleague of mine, I gave it to him to read, and he said, the men come out really not in your book. And I said, really, that wasn't really what, and I revised what I said, not obviously what the women said. But I think a lot of it is to do with societal norms and what is expected, and with definitions of masculinity. Again, it's about there was a big survey that showed, for instance, that employees themselves, when, for instance, a child is ill, men automatically assume that it's the woman, and within couples, they assume that it would be more, that the employer will be more receptive to these kind. Now with the pandemic, the Financial Times did a huge project where they invited women and men to write about their experiences. And one of the common things that comes up is how now with the pandemic, sometimes when men would come with their children would come into a Zoom meeting, everybody would say, "Oh, that's so adorable, it's so sweet." And women would not dare. Women in the Financial Times kind of archive now say, "I wouldn't dare bring in my child because it would be just not accommodated or allowed in a way. So I think, yes, there are very strong societal norms that, we are, what my book and what my project show, none of us is immune of these. We are internalizing them. I think part of the story is also about what happens in marriages. Part of the story is the lack of this conversation between men and women in the home about what one of the things that really struck me is how women described how this momentous decision of quitting their jobs just happened. They said, I just found myself. And I said, what do you mean? You never talk, you never really, I imagined couples will have this big conversation about, and most of them didn't. So I think, and I would say, not all men, but I think partly because the society we live in is such that is still generally patriarchal, that yes, men are invested in perpetuating it, not because they're bad or they're mean, but because it's a system that is designed to continue encouraging them to invest in this, and vice versa. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I suppose, my take would also be that there is also a very real investment, which is there is a self-sustaining model of male success, right? And cultural change is only possible when people want to change culture, right? And actually, it must be on some level. I mean, I chose not to go into that world, right? But on some level, it must be working for people that there is this kind of cultural boys
Absolutely.
club, that people are staying working late and going drinking afterwards.
Absolutely.
And it's also there is also, yes, men should come out badly in some of this.
Yeah, I should say my original plan in the beginning of the study was to interview women and then to interview not their husbands, but men who are partners or married to women who left the workplace. I had lots of men lined up. They committed to the interview. They flaked just the interview. I'm too busy and so on. I did end up interviewing, but only 5 men, and they do make it into the. And I think what was striking in those 5 interviews is that the story you get them is just completely different. We are an egalitarian team. And I said, how is it egalitarian? And he says, I'm gardening on the weekend. And she's doing the shopping, the cooking, and they kind of lived the myth of an egalitarian team and a teamwork and so on. And many of the women I spoke to told me explicitly, if you speak to my husband, you'll hear a completely different story. So there's even an awareness that they live parallel narratives. But it was a very convenient story for at least the men I interviewed to tell. And they did not, what they failed to recognize is how, I think, painful this decision has been for their partners. They seem to think that things are fantastic, that their wives are happily ever after, doing manicure and so on. And so part of the story is also indeed, as I say, the book kind of spotlights, and I'm ever more grateful to the women I interviewed who were enormously candid. And I should say, despite living in this country, I'm Israeli, as you might have suspected, everybody. Despite living in this country for many, many years, when I went to interview these women, many of them were British. I thought they'll probably be reserved. They won't be as open as maybe Israeli women would be. And I'm ever more grateful for just the honesty and the candid way in which these women shared with me very intimate and very painful and very difficult moments in this trajectory of their coming of age, entering the workplace, enjoying successful careers and quitting them to become stay-at-home mothers.
Let's open it up as we can. Are there questions? Apparently not. Knowles. And then Jeremy. Great. Nolene, you're going to need to mute yourselves. Yep.
Unmute.
Unmute yourselves. Okay, Jeremy can unmute himself whilst. Anyway, Jeremy. Is unmuting just not working?
You've unmuted me now, Josh.
Okay, go on.
The host to unmute you.
Oh, it's Adam's fault. Okay, good.
Hi, Shani. Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. So I grew up in that time. Fortuitously at home, I don't have that. But like you, I'm the mother of boys, and I don't know if you spoke to those women, if they, you know, they felt that wherever their situation was, and it doesn't talk, I suppose, in some way to the impatience doctrine, and I think you're 100% correct. But are we bringing up our boys differently? Are we, you know, are we working on a different narrative for our boys? And I know sometimes that role model thing, fathers and boys exists, but, you know, is it possible? Will that change?
Well, you know, I hope, I know that I'm doing my best. My two boys are downstairs listening to this lecture now. But I think I'd say something that, again, the last chapter of my book is about what message these women pass on to their children. And one of the things that struck me is that for women who had both girls and boys, they admitted, again, in a very, you know, they kind of paused, and one woman said, I know it's wrong, but they admitted giving different messages to their boys and their girls. To their daughters, they would say, when they say teenagers or later, they said, one woman captured it when she said, I'd tell her, you know, be a GP, don't be a surgeon. Yeah. Curb your enthusiasm, curb your ambition. And I said to her, I asked her, would you say the same to your child, to your boy? And she said, no. And I said, why? And I think it's rooted in this slightly even fatalist acceptance of this is how things are. And my job as a parent is to prepare her as best to the reality. And the reality is that workplaces are not compatible and are not friendly still to women. Rather than thinking, how do we raise kids that will contribute to changing the system?
Yeah.
I think, you know, from the research I read about children, I think things are changing, partly because also gender is becoming, has probably always been, but is now at least more in the open, much more fluid. So that's something that some kind of might disturb some of these kind of rigid definitions. And indeed, in some studies of, by the way, of gay couple, you see quite different, for instance, in terms of equality and sharing at home, you see different patterns from the predominantly unequal patterns in heterosexual homes. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think what struck me in the interviews with women is that they admitted it. So they, again, knew that it's wrong. But that they nevertheless felt that their role is to prepare them to an existing, to adjust to the status quo, yeah, rather than thinking how we're changing the status quo. So I'm hoping, you know, part of my work is with policymakers and so on, but also thinking about how this can translate, for instance, to changing messages to children. You know, I'm doing a different project now that looks, for instance, at children's books and what messages these give from early age.
Yes, Topsy and Tim I was raised on, which is the most gendered books, like gender role stereotyped books in, you know, they're almost laughable now, but it was what we were raised on. Anyway, Jeremy, sorry, Topsy and Tim.
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation because we've been living through a very interesting period. So I work in the civil service, which I think is probably one of the more forgiving atmospheres, although albeit still very restrictive for people with family needs. I mean, they talk the talk, but it doesn't always work. So up until COVID-19, those of us who were lucky enough to be able to work from home on a laptop were allowed to do so under certain restrictions, but core hours were 10 till 4. So effectively, it allowed for a certain amount of taking to or bringing from school or whatever, but you were still very restricted. But something very interesting happened with COVID and the lockdown, because of course, people were then stuck at home with their children. And for the first time I recall, in a number of cases, I've come across people who said, I'm unavailable for the 2 or 3 hours, these 2 or 3 hours in the day, because I have, you know, that's my time to sort out the family. And so they're doing what might be seen to be very strange hours. Whereas previously, so you'd have to do your 10 till 4, and probably most of us would end up doing more hours afterwards. So it was just the always on. just for this period, there's been an element of allowance for children being at home. However, I strongly suspect we're not going to have that for long enough for it to bake in as anything fixed. But I was just interested to see that that was available for now.
I think you're absolutely right. And to me, I think, you know, this pandemic is horrible, but in this context, it's a rare moment where some of these rigid structures seem to be changing just because they're forced upon us. But I suspect, like you, unfortunately, that, you know, as we regain normality, the new normal will not necessarily be a new normal in terms of gender. And again, from all the evidence that's been collected so far, unfortunately, gender inequality has kind of taken a hit. So you may have seen lots of headlines recently. Is the pandemic making women again back in the 50s and so on?
Mayrav, did you have a question?
I was just wondering if you've had any research or conversations with the women who tried to get back. I'm one of these women who quit and whatever. I didn't really quit. I was made to be a freelancer and my job just had ended and I had no job and I had no maternity pay and I was, NGO sector. That was even more crazy. There was no job. There was nothing at all. So I would have had to try and get new jobs. And I've kind of been trying to get new jobs ever since. And it's been about 15 years. I'm still sort of slowly inching my way back. And I'm wondering if you have any research dealing with that, the return. Kids do grow up in the end and you are kind of free in the end. So,
yeah, I think the two things that, first of all, I'd say that, many of the women I interviewed, their kids were already in secondary school. And they were still out, and they found lots of ways to rationalize it. They need me more than ever, and so on. The research is not about women necessarily with very young children. My research stopped at, when women quit. But as I said, I interviewed women who were between 3 years outside the workplace to 17 years outside the workplace. 2 women wrote to me recently that they went back to some part-time work. In fact, one woman wrote me after the interview, not that I'm not responsible for her return, but she said that the interview was pretty much the first time she has spoken and uttered her desire in some ways for many, many years. And it instigated kind of something in her, and she's back now in part-time work. I would only say that there's another scholar in the US called Pamela Stone, who did a similar research back in 2007 about women who opted out, and just now published a book. She went back to the same women, many of whom went back to work, but then she documents the very many new obstacles and hurdles they're now facing. So it's not necessarily for them just kind of a rosy picture. But I haven't myself spoken or interviewed. It might be my next project. We'll see. Good luck.
You can interview me. I live in Muswell Hill. I'd be happy to tell you what I'm experiencing.
Let's catch up.
Thank you.
So I have one last question, and then we're going to let people get out into the sun who can. So why do you think? So you referred quite a few times to Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In book, which was so polarizing in some ways, but was also the best-selling business book of the last sort of 5 years. So, and was reviewed, very positively by lots of powerful and successful women. Why do you think that narrative of success resonated so strongly for people, rather than the kind of lean out, let's address the structural inequalities, let's really critique the institutions? Why was that the route that seemed to be prominent in that period?
I think precisely because it is fitting in. What it tells women is play the game, play the corporate game in her case. And I think what this book does, and I would want to believe that it does it genuinely, but I think very problematically, it kind of, it moves away from the supposed myth. So she shares some of her struggles and she gives some evidence and figures about how women are. So it's framed very much as an honest account. Let's have this honest conversation, which I think was very kind of appealing. And of course, it's an amazingly, she's an amazingly successful woman. But I think the reason it was successful is precisely because it supports the existing system, and it fitted very nicely. And it therefore was also embraced very much also by many successful men and businessmen and the male structure more generally, because it's not about shaking the structure. She's not questioning their working hours, for instance. That's something that doesn't come up in Lean. It's all about, a lot about, there's some structural aspect, but it's a lot about how you sit at the table, what is called, how you internalize a revolution, how you take responsibility and make it. And that's something that fits fantastically well with kind of the neoliberal rationale of our times, which is about self-responsibility, which is about the individual and not the structure. So that's, to me, that would be my explanation of its fundamental success, precisely because it supports the status quo and doesn't shake it up.
Okay. We've reached 8 o'clock, which is the time that we've chosen to end each of these. I could go on for quite a while, but maybe another time we'll keep talking. I'd love to talk about children's books as well. I was just thinking about The Tiger Who Came for Tea, and just how extraordinary that I still read that to my daughter or to my son. I mean, what the hell were we thinking reading that to our kids? Anyway, that's for another time. Shani, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And everyone, please do join us next week when Gordon will be speaking about the dome at St. Paul's Cathedral. And again, Shani, thank you so much. Please go out, enjoy the sun.